The Harwick Estate sat on the edge of Lake Simcoe like a fortress that had decided long ago it had nothing left to prove. Juneau Voss had been warned about it before she ever arrived. The grounds are immaculate, the placement coordinator at the agency had told her, sliding the file across the desk with both hands like it was something fragile. Mr. Harwick is particular about his staff. 3 nurses in the last 8 months. What happened to them? Juneau asked. The coordinator smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. They found positions better suited to their temperaments. Juneau took the file. She was 26 years old, newly licensed, and had $43 in her checking account. She had a student loan that felt like a second mortgage and a mother in Sudbury who called every Sunday to ask when she was going to find something stable. She had been a nurse for 11 months. She did not have the luxury of a temperament. The position was for a live-in private nurse at the Harwick Estate, caring for Edwin Harwick, 78, recovering from a hip replacement complicated by mild cardiac arrhythmia. The compensation was more than Juneau had made in the previous 4 months combined. The house was 60 kilometers north of Barrie. There was a staff cottage. Meals were provided. The file did not mention Conrad Harwick. She learned about him the way you learn about most things in houses like that. Not from anyone who worked there, but from the silence that moved through rooms ahead of him. She arrived on a Tuesday in November, when the lake had gone the color of pewter and the birches along the drive had stripped themselves bare. A woman named Mrs. Delacroix, the housekeeper, met her at the side entrance and walked her through the house in 17 minutes flat, pointing at doors and naming rooms, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no interest in conversation. The kitchen, the linen closet, the medication station, set up in the east wing near Mr. Edwin's suite. Juneau's cottage was behind the main house, through a covered walkway past the woodshed. "Mr. Harwick's breakfast is at 7, Mrs. Delacroix said, and Juneau assumed she meant Edwin until the housekeeper added, "He does not like noise before then. He does not like questions at breakfast. He does not like questions generally." "Mr. Edwin?" Juneau asked, just to be sure. Mrs. Delacroix looked at her for the first time. "Conrad," she said. Then she handed Juneau a laminated schedule and left. Juneau met Edwin Harwick that evening. He was sitting up in the hospital-style bed that had been installed in what had probably once been a sitting room, watching hockey with the sound turned low, and he looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression of such studied wariness that she almost laughed. "You're the new one," he said. "Juneau Voss." She set her bag down and moved to check his vitals without being asked. "How's the incision site feeling? Like someone sawed through my hip and bolted it back together." "That's about right." She checked his chart. His blood pressure was good. Better than her own, probably. "The last notation says you've been resisting the compression stockings. I'm 78. I've earned the right to resist things." "You've also earned a DVT if we're not careful, so we're going to work on that." She pulled the stockings from the drawer where someone had left them in a resigned heap. "Leg out." He stared at her. She waited. He put his leg out. They understood each other after that. It was 3 days before she met Conrad Harwick. She heard him first. Footsteps in the hallway outside Edwin's suite at 6:45 in the morning. Unhurried, deliberate, the kind of walk that expected the floor to cooperate. She was reviewing Edwin's overnight notes when the door opened without a knock. He was taller than she expected, which was irrational because she hadn't expected anything. Dark coat, dark suit under it, the kind of tired that lives in the jaw and not the eyes. He was somewhere in his mid to late 30s, and he moved through the room like he owned it, which he did, technically, though that wasn't what she meant. He looked at his father first. Something passed over his face, brief, unguarded, before it closed again. Then he looked at Juneau. "You're the nurse," he said. "Juneau Voss." She didn't extend her hand. He didn't look like he wanted her to. "He slept well. Vitals are stable. He ate most of his dinner." Conrad Harwick looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, not rude exactly, assessing. "The last one let him skip the physio exercises," he said. "I know. I read the notes. He'll try the same thing with you." Edwin, who was very much awake, said, "I'm in the room." Conrad looked at his father with an expression that might have been affection, filtered through a decade of practice at not showing it. "I know you are." He picked up the chart from the foot of the bed, scanned it, set it back. Then he looked at Juneau again. "I'm in the city 4 days a week. Mrs. Delacroix has my number." "Understood," Juneau said. He left without another word. Edwin watched his son go, then looked at Juneau. "Don't take it personally," he said. "He's like that with everyone." "I didn't take it personally," Juneau said. But she filed it away. She filed everything away. It was a habit she'd picked up in nursing school. The small details that didn't fit the chart, the observations that didn't have a box to check, the way Conrad Harwick had looked at his father before he looked at anything else, the way his hand had rested on the doorframe for just a second on his way out, as though he'd considered something and then decided against it. She didn't think about it again. She had a patient to look after. Edwin Harwick was, as it turned out, a difficult man in a way that was almost charming. He had opinions about everything. About the maple syrup she put on his oatmeal, too dark. About the angle of his bed, 2 degrees off. About the way the Toronto papers covered anything north of Steeles Avenue, poorly. And with condescension, he had been a civil engineer. He had designed 3 bridges and a dam. He showed her the photographs once, a little sheepishly, the way people do when they're proud of something old. She took his vitals. She managed his medications. She ran him through his physio exercises 3 times a day and held her ground when he said his hip felt fine and maybe they could skip it. "Your son will check the log," she said. "My son checks everything," Edwin said, not with bitterness, with something more complicated than bitterness. On her 4th week, she started playing guitar after her shift. It wasn't intentional. She'd brought the guitar because she'd been living out of a bag for 3 months before this posting, couch to couch, and the guitar went everywhere she went. It was a battered Seagull she'd bought second-hand in her 2nd year of nursing school, and it had survived a basement flood and a cross-country bus trip and an ex-boyfriend who'd nicked the strap, and it was the one thing she owned that was entirely hers. The cottage was small and warm and quiet after 9 o'clock, and she would sit on the narrow bench by the window with the guitar across her lap and play half-finished things, songs she'd been writing since she was 17 and never finished, because she could never figure out how they were supposed to end. She'd had a notion, once, that she might do something with music. Before the student loans, before the practicalities. Now it was just something she did in the quiet for herself, the same way some people did crosswords. She didn't think anyone could hear her. The cottage sat behind the main house. The covered walkway was 30 meters of stone and glass, and in November, with the wind off the lake, she assumed any sound would be swallowed before it reached the main building. She was wrong. She found out 5 weeks in on a Thursday morning, when she arrived at the medication station, to find Conrad Harwick already in the kitchen, standing at the window with a coffee cup still in his coat. He'd come back the night before. She'd seen the lights in the main house when she was locking up the cottage, and heard Mrs. Delacroix's heels on the stone walkway. He looked at her when she came in. "You play," he said. It wasn't a question. She understood, with a flush of something she decided to call professionalism, that he had heard her. "Sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't think. I'll stop if it's disruptive." "I didn't say it was disruptive." He looked back out at the lake. The ice had started to form at the edges, grey and tentative. "What was that last one? The one with thee?" He paused and made a small gesture with his hand that somehow conveyed a chord progression. "The one that didn't finish." Juneau stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her medication tray and felt something strange move through her chest. "It doesn't have an ending yet," she said. Conrad Harwick looked at her again. "Why not?" She didn't know how to explain it, that some things just stayed open, that she'd spent years trying to write an ending for that particular song, and nothing she tried felt like the truth. "It's not ready," she said. He considered this. Then he picked up his briefcase from the counter. "Don't let my father skip the afternoon session," he said. He told Mrs. Delacroix his hip felt fine. "I know," Juneau said. "I heard him." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone, looking at the coffee cup he'd left on the counter, still steaming. She went to give Edwin his morning medications. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. Edwin improved steadily, the hip loosening, the arrhythmia cooperating, the compression stockings being worn with increasingly less protest. He was a good patient underneath the stubbornness, the kind who actually wanted to get better, rather than just wanting to be told he was getting better. He did his exercises. He ate what she put in front of him. He slept. Conrad was there on weekends and sometimes midweek. He moved through the house quietly, which surprised her. She'd expected something louder from him, something more consistent with the way he occupied space. But he read in the library in the evenings, or worked at the desk in the study, and the only time she saw him was in the mornings when she came to do Edwin's vitals, and he was already in the kitchen. He always left a second coffee cup. She didn't mention it. He didn't mention it. She started timing her morning rounds, so she passed through the kitchen first. She knew it was a bad idea. She catalogued the reasons carefully, the way she catalogued everything. She was staff, he was the employer, she was 26, and whatever he was, 37 or 38, and she had a contract and a patient to focus on, and she had not come to Lake Simcoe to do something foolish with a man who spoke in full sentences like he was billing by the word. She still timed her rounds to pass through the kitchen. In December, 2 things happened. The first was that Edwin had a bad night. Not a crisis, but a sustained arrhythmia that woke her at 2 in the morning, when the monitor she kept linked to her phone fired an alert. She was in his room within 4 minutes, assessed him, called the on-call cardiologist in Barry, and spent the next 40 minutes managing his vitals and talking to him about the 1972 Summit Series, because she had learned that Edwin Harwick found hockey calming in a way that most people found medication calming. Conrad was in the doorway at 2:35. She heard him arrive but didn't look up from what she was doing. "His rhythm is settling," she said. The cardiologist adjusted his medication protocol over the phone. "I'm monitoring him for the next 2 hours before I decide whether we need to transfer him." Silence. She heard him cross the room. He sat in the chair on the other side of Edwin's bed, not in her way, not demanding anything. He picked up the paperback from Edwin's nightstand, a spy novel, bent-spined with a coffee stain on the cover, and opened it. He stayed until 4 o'clock. He didn't say anything. When Edwin's rhythm had settled properly and she'd logged the final vitals and lowered the lights, she found Conrad still in the chair, reading. "He's stable," she said quietly. He looked up. In the low light, he looked less managed than usual, tired in a way he hadn't been hiding, or had stopped trying to hide. "Good," he said. He set the book down. "Thank you, Miss Voss Juneau," she said. She wasn't sure why. He looked at her. "Juneau," he said. She went back to her cottage at 4:15 and did not sleep. The second thing that happened in December was that Mrs. Delacroix pulled her aside on a Friday afternoon and told her, with no particular expression, that the agency had called. There was an inquiry from another family, a posting in Ottawa, a long-term patient who needed specialized cardiac nursing, a very competitive offer. The agency wanted to know if Juneau would consider it when her current contract ended in February. "They called here?" Juneau asked. "They called Mr. Harwick's office," Mrs. Delacroix said, "as they are required to regarding placement changes." Juneau absorbed this. What did Mr. Harwick say? He said he'd pass along the message. Mrs. Delacroix handed her the slip of paper with the agency coordinator's number. "I imagine he would prefer you stay until Mr. Edwin is fully cleared for independent living, but that's between you and the agency." That night, Juneau sat on the bench in the cottage and held the guitar without playing it. The lake outside was frozen solid now, flat and white under the cloud cover, and the light from the main house fell in long rectangles across the snow. She thought about Ottawa. She thought about the loan payment due in January. She thought about her mother asking, again, if she'd found something stable. She played the unfinished song. She played it through twice, and on the third time, she found the ending. It arrived the way endings sometimes did, not with fanfare but with a small, solid click, like a key turning in a lock. She sat for a moment after the last chord faded, surprised by it. She wrote it down before she forgot. She didn't sleep much that night either, but for different reasons. The next morning, Saturday, just past 8, she came through the kitchen and Conrad was there. The second coffee cup, the lake outside the window, white and still. "I heard you found it," he said without turning around. She stopped. "Pardon?" He turned. "The ending. For the song." He looked at her steadily. "I could hear when you found it." She set down the medication tray. She wasn't sure she could explain how it felt, having someone hear that. It was a private thing, the moment of finding an ending, the small internal shift of something becoming whole. It was the kind of thing she'd only ever experienced alone. "The agency called," she said. "I know. Ottawa. I know," he said again. Then he looked at his coffee. "It's a good position. It's a very good position." He was quiet. Outside, a crow landed on the snow at the edge of the lake and walked 2 precise steps and stopped. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and the cedar wood that heated the main house through the winter, and Juneau stood in the middle of it and waited for something she couldn't name. "My father likes you," Conrad said. Which, for context, he has said about approximately no one in the last 78 years. "He likes me because I make him do the physio. He likes you because you don't treat him like he's dying." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "Because you sit with him at 9 o'clock when he can't sleep and argue about hockey instead of charting in the hallway. Because you knew the difference between what the monitor was telling you and what he actually needed at 2 in the morning." Juneau was quiet. "That's my job," she said finally. "I know it's your job." He set the coffee cup down. "I'm not explaining why I think you're good at your job." She looked at him. He looked back. In 37 days. And she was aware, distantly, that she had been counting. She had learned to read the small variations in his expression, the way she read a patient's chart, the tension in the jaw that meant he was worried about his father, the slight softening around the eyes that passed for warmth when he didn't have the energy to suppress it. He was looking at her now with something that wasn't quite either of those things. "I don't know how to ask things," he said. It sounded like an admission that cost him something. "I've been told that. I ask questions like they're statements. I state things when I should ask. He stopped. Started again with the deliberate quality of a man who had rehearsed several versions of this. "I'd like it if you stayed. Past February. I'd like to adjust the terms of the position so it wasn't contingent on my father's recovery. I'd like..." Another stop. "I don't know if any of that is something you'd want." The crow outside had not moved. Juneau picked up the medication tray. "I'm going to go check on your father," she said. She watched his face fall, very briefly and very quietly, and then she said, "And then I'm going to come back and have that coffee, and we're going to talk about this properly." He looked at her. The jaw tension she'd catalogued for 5 weeks broke, finally, into something that was unmistakably, thoroughly a smile. "Okay," he said. Edwin Harwick, when she arrived in his suite, was sitting up with his reading glasses on and an expression of complete innocence. "You look pleased about something," Juneau said, checking his chart. "I'm always pleased in the morning," Edwin said. "I'm 78 and I woke up. Leg out?" She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Leg out," she confirmed. She got through the session in 40 minutes. She logged his vitals, noted his continuing improvement, wrote a note to the cardiologist about the previous night's stability. She straightened his blanket, refilled his water, organized the morning medications in the little paper cup. She paused at the door. "Mr. Harwick," she said. Edwin looked up over his reading glasses. "The agency in Ottawa. I'm going to call them this afternoon and decline." He studied her for a moment. His expression did not change much, but his eyes went soft at the corners in a way she had only seen once before, in the photograph he'd shown her of the first bridge he'd ever designed. Something he'd made that had lasted. "Well," he said, "I suppose that saves Mrs. Delacroix from having to break in another one." Juneau laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. It rose out of her before she could manage it, real and unguarded, and Edwin smiled at her from his hospital bed, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted and was pretending he hadn't. She walked back through the covered walkway, through the stone and glass corridor with the frost on the outside of the windows and the warmth on the inside, and the lake spread out white and wide to the north, and the light in the kitchen was on. She had $43 in her checking account. She had a student loan and a guitar with a nicked strap and an ending she'd found by herself in the dark, in a small cottage on the edge of a frozen lake. She pushed open the kitchen door. The coffee was still warm.